started the network in 2007, and we have 9 project teams that we call landscape teams. And some of them have been very active in fire and have also had a number of wildfires. So one of our project areas is called the Central Escarpments, and that includes the Grandfather Ranger District of the Pisgah National Forest. And we have engaged together with the consortium of Appalachian fire managers and scientists in an outreach effort that has received a lot of attention. So I'm really excited to have Jennifer Bunty, who started off with the Fire Learning Network and now works for the consortium, to tell us about the Fire Learning Trail outreach and tell us a little bit more about Limbo Gorge and how it all works. So thank you so much for hosting the meeting this webinar today. So thanks. I'll pass it over to Jen.
Great. Thanks, Margaret. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, and are we recording?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Now those technical issues are out of the way. So thanks, Margaret, for that intro, and Liz for hosting, and for the Nature Conservancy for supporting this project and hosting this webinar, and to all of you for joining us this morning. I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the consortium and who I am and what I do and what we do with the consortium. For those of you who aren't familiar, we are just one of several consortia or knowledge exchanges funded through the Joint Fire Science Program. We cover the entire United States, including the Pacific and the Pacific Islands and Alaska. And our consortium covers just the Appalachian Mountains, so all the way from Alabama up through Pennsylvania and Ohio. And our goal really is sort of right in our name. We're the Consortium for Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists, so we link fire managers and scientists. And our major goal is to make sure that research being funded by the Joint Fire Science Program is getting used on the ground, and that managers' questions are getting to researchers so they can get answers to the right questions, and we can get fire on the ground in the right places throughout the Appalachian Mountains. Part of the way we do that is through workshops and field trips, meetings, publications. These pictures are all from our recent road trip. You might see Margaret in a few of them. She joined us for 3 days where we went around to 3 of the major wildfires from the 2016 wildfire season to take lessons learned and to talk about fire effects and just, to network and get managers and scientists together. We also have another webinar coming up next week talking about our recent publication, The Synthesis of Fire History in the Appalachians. It's going to be hosted by Charles LaFawn for Texas A&M University, a brilliant fire history researcher. And so that just gives you an idea of where we're coming from. What I do for the consortium, and part of my role with the Fire Learning Network that Margaret mentioned, is somewhat public outreach, but basically just science delivery and science communication. And I started with the Fire Learning Network. I was brought on to create a trail to talk about fire in the landscape that you're looking at right now. So this is the beautiful Limbo Gorge wilderness area. It's a view that really never gets old. I've given this talk several times, and every time I see this slide, it sort of catches my breath. And the Forest Service has evidence from fire history studies that this area burned about every 3 to 7 years historically. It's also surrounded by urban interface, so there's people moving in very close to the gorge. So there is a threat of fuel loading on the ground. And they've determined that there's a need for prescribed fire in this area. But like a lot of areas, maybe on a lot of your landscapes for the people listening, they were met with a lot of pushback for all of their planning. In fact, they were met with over 1,500 signatures on a change.org petition to try and stop burning in the Limbo Gorge. The comments that I just pulled up here are all comments that were left by people signing the petition. So my personal favorite is that one at the bottom, burning forests is stupid, just puts it right out there. And so what we took from this, besides the fact that the U.S. Forest Service had to put sort of a halt on their plans, what we took from this is that the people in this area really were in need of some education. There was definitely misinformation being spread around about how controlled burning would work in this area. And we decided that the best way to do this would be through an educational trail. The people working in this area, the U.S. Forest Service and the Nature Conservancy, had done several driving tours of the area, and those seemed to be really successful, but like we all know, we can't take everyone on a driving tour every day. So we tried to design a trail that would work a lot like a driving tour, you know, signs in various places that you could drive to, not in a classic sense of a trail that you would walk from location to location, but something that would start to pull together the whole message and the whole idea of fire and fire history on this landscape. The general design of our trail, I like to think of them as tiers or breadcrumbs that sort of pull people into a larger conversation. So the base tier are educational signs like the one you're seeing there on the left. They're National Park Service style wayside signs, 24 inches by 36 inches. And they have a minimum of wording, a maximum actually of 500 words per sign. So we tried to keep just minimal words on them, lots of pictures, lots of infographics, to try and cut down on, well, really to try and keep people from losing interest and try to draw them further into a conversation. The next sort of tier we talked about was an audio tour available on CDs and as a podcast, which you can find through iTunes if you search for Fire Learning. It's just called the Fire Learning Trail. And then the third tier, that third breadcrumb that really draws people into the conversation, was a social media and launch campaign so that people can actually communicate with fire professionals, fire researchers, fire management officers, and try and get people, you know, even if we can't get them face to face, we can get them talking and get the information straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So I'm going to go ahead and give away the ending a little bit. We have seen success with this trail. That's part of the reason we're doing this webinar today, is to try and spread the word about how we developed it. Currently, there are about 50,000 people seeing #GoodFire per week, that hashtag that we created to go with the trail. We've had more than 2,700 podcast subscribers or podcast downloads. And we had 75 plus visitors on opening day, which was last May. I'm sure they keep some tabs on visitors to the first stop, which is at the Linville Gorge Information Cabin. But there's really no telling. You know, we assume that the impact is actually greater than these numbers because there's so many ways that people can get the podcasts and get the audio files that don't go through our counters. There's ways that people can see #GoodFire and participate in this conversation that we can't necessarily track. And of course, the visitors are hard to track because so many come through the Linville Gorge every day. So we think and we feel that this is really having a big impact in terms of numbers. But something that I find very telling is if we go back to those comments at the beginning, about 6 months after we put this trail in, someone on the Linville Gorge Facebook group page started putting out messages against burning, talking about how the Forest Service only does controlled burns for the money. And, you know, I know a lot of Forest Service employees. I don't know any of them that drive BMWs, so I'm not sure where all that money is going to. But they started putting out this messaging and misinformation again, and they were met with comments like this. People don't join the Forest Service for the money. They do it because they love the land. If they get rid of dead stuff with prescribed burns, then it decreases the chance of fires that get out of control. Where are you getting your quote-unquote science from? That's one of my favorites. And they even talked about animals and forest regeneration. The great part about each of these comments is even though it's not necessarily you know, a statistical analysis, we were able to go back and see that these people had participated in the online conversation by using #GoodFire. that they had visited signs, that they had downloaded these podcasts. And each of these messages almost directly comes from the podcasts and the signs. So we were able to see almost in real time how this conversation was changing, how previously someone might have put out misinformation on this group page about how controlled burning works and how fire and the Forest Service works. And we were sort of able to preach to the choir and give people this correct information so that they could have better conversations themselves. Okay, so now I've given this talk several times as a success story, but since we've gone through that already, and what I was hoping to do today was go more into depth about our development process and our design process for the signs and for the podcast and for the social media campaign. So hopefully, if you're joining us, you can start to think about how to apply this, either this method or some lessons from this to whatever field you're in or whatever landscape you're working on. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the signs. Again, that's that first breadcrumb in the trail. So each of the signs had 500 words or less, and the way we came up with 500 words was that it takes about 90 seconds to read that out loud. And some great advice I got a while back was from a national park supervisor who said, you should always think about mom, or you should always think about a parent with a child, because they're going to be the most probably distracted demographic possible, and the people that need the most support from infrastructure and recreation and communications programs. And so I thought, okay, 90 seconds might be an upper limit of what you would get if a parent was reading a sign to a child. And that's how we came up with 500 words or less. Again, we're focusing more on infographics and photos. We use the Nature Conservancy guidelines for talking about fire and talking about conservation. The Nature Conservancy has a ton of great research that they've paid for to figure out how to really get messages through to people. Because as biologists, ecologists, fire managers, foresters, we like to speak in our own jargon. We have all our lingo. I mean, even on here, I just realized I use TNC instead of writing out the Nature Conservancy. You know, y'all know we love an acronym. So it's really important to try and take ourselves out of that and think about the way, quote unquote, normal people talk, or the average people speak to each other. And using terms like controlled burn instead of prescribed fire, things that mean more to people. Controlled burn, people have generally a positive attitude towards, as opposed to prescribed fire. People hear prescription, they think healthcare and doctors, and as we know, that's all kind of a mess right now, so we try and stay away from that. We tried to include messages about the importance of clean water and unique aspects of the area, so a lot of times in the signs we talked about how fire preserves the look or the unique essence of Appalachian forests. We also tried to tie it to other interests, so things like history, the Civil War. A lot of people come through this area to learn about the history of the area, even Native American history, and anything we can do to tie it to that, to get that sort of door in, can make a big difference. And of course, safety first. We always want to talk about firefighter safety, and we want to mention that the people setting controlled burns are wildland firefighters. Something we notice time and time again is that people love wildland firefighters. They love us when we're going out and putting fires out and saving homes, but once we go around in the spring and try to set controlled burns, suddenly we're the bad guy. A lot of times people don't realize that these are the exact same people in most cases. So trying to tie that idea together that these are fire professionals, that they, you know, a red card gives you a license to start and stop fires is really important. Another thing we tried to focus on with our imagery is tying the sign to the location if possible. So if you're looking at a sign, and I have an example of this later, if you're looking at a sign, make sure your background picture is of the thing you're looking at. One of my pet peeves is especially historical signs, for some reason, like to say, oh, a mile from here, something important happened. And I'm always thinking, well, why isn't the sign where that is? Or why isn't there a picture of what that is on the sign? So you really want to tie that message to where that person's feet are. Give it, you know, give that message to them in that space, in that time, and they'll take it with them a lot further. And the last and probably most important point is that if your audience is talking, we should be listening. And so one of the things that we did when we first started developing this project, I like to call it, researching the enemy. I'm a military kid, so that's a little bit of an intense term, but what I did was I went into these online conversations that we saw were happening, and I pulled out the messages that were getting repeated, those pieces of misinformation that were getting repeated, and I figured out what a counter message would be. And so instead of engaging in a direct debate, what we did was just put out these facts, these pieces of information, so that people were able to take it with them and weigh these things, weigh these different viewpoints for themselves, and usually, hopefully they come out on the correct side. And so we found 4 major messages that were getting put out. Like I said, people didn't seem to understand that firefighters were the ones doing controlled burns. And so for our first sign, we wanted to make sure we got that idea across. Again, you see in that main block, there's 500 words or less. We have pictures of firefighters looking calm, cool, collected, small flame heights. They're sitting back and just watching the fire and everything's going easy. And so that image can say so much that we don't even have to say it. And of course, if you look at the top right there, we talk about PPE, personal protective equipment, so getting that safety first message across. And we try to use common language, again, simple language. We actually had these signs looked over. Part of our review process was sending them out to school-aged children, and that was so enlightening because we had the opportunity to get their viewpoint on words they didn't understand or elements of the signs that they didn't like. There was one element on one of these that I thought was really cool, and several of the kids found it scary. So that was a great part of the design process. Our second message was we kind of got the idea that people didn't understand where this was coming from. We have a lot of people that are transplants to this area and don't understand the fire history of the area, or that, we've been fighting wildfires and setting controlled burns for years, and that's just part of our landscape in western North Carolina. So this sign really tried to tie that history together to give people the idea that, this is a long-standing program. And it also, again, tried to tie it into different interests. That little blurb in the middle talks about how protecting our forests was a necessary war measure in 1918, so World War I. It also talks about, this poster on the side was from a 1915 state geologist survey. So the campers and wagoners, that language was taken directly from that state geologist report. So we tried to tie it to other interests with this sign. This sign is at one of the most popular spots in the Linville Gorge at Wisemans View, Wisemans Overlook. And it really gets to the heart of the matter of the fire suppression era, talking about why we have this huge fuel buildup and why controlled burning is so necessary now. And it also talks about the natural history that we know that the gorge is burnt every 3 to 7 years. And you see this little infographic at the bottom talking about what an acre is. So we're kind of getting some general knowledge stuff out there as well. And again, just trying to tie all of this fire history, all of this ecology to other interests that people might have. And the fourth thing we noticed or the fourth sort of major message that we were getting was that people seem to be confused about the process of succession. As an ecologist, I talked about succession all the time. I was actually defending my master's thesis while I was designing these signs. So this sign I'm especially proud of because it took a lot for me to pull out of that mindset of writing a thesis to using language that didn't include things like ecosystem or landscape or green infrastructure, all of those words or climax community, even things like that, all of those words that the average person doesn't have a strong tie to. Explaining the process of succession as a cycle, that the forest will regenerate. A lot of people seem to have the idea that forests burn and they're just done, like they're just a moonscape or a parking lot, no life left. And so I think describing it as a cycle was the best way to get the point across that, even if fire comes through here, even if we do a controlled burn or if a wildfire comes through here, you'll see this regeneration, you'll see this new life, and that there's a lot of plants and animals that can actually benefit from this process. So now that I've talked about the sign design, I wanted to talk a little bit about our podcast recording and how we developed that. This shows our exact podcast setup. This is Paul Nolan, the park supervisor for Table Rock State Park in South Carolina. You can see it's a pretty fancy setup. We're actually just in the visitor center here. What you're looking at on the left is a tote bin, sort of like the kind that you might store Christmas decorations in your attic, lined with a blanket with a microphone in the middle, and that round thing in front of it is called a pop filter, and it just cuts out your P's and S's and hard consonant sounds. And so for the podcast recording, we used a free program called Audacity. You can download it, like I said, for free, and it allows you to upload your podcast to iTunes in MP4 format, or I'm sorry, MP3 format. And there's a ton of YouTube videos about how to do this and how to use this program. And if anyone's interested at the end, I can also send out links about the basics of podcast recording. But one of the things I love about this medium is that, number one, it's super cheap to produce. That microphone costs about $120, maybe $130 or $150 with the pop filter. Tote bin and blanket came from my supervisor Helen's attic, so for all intents and purposes free. And really all it requires is time to edit. And podcasts do take a lot of time to edit, just like video, because you have to listen to them in real time in order to cut out any spaces or anything that anyone says awkwardly, and just sort of arrange them in a way that makes sense. But to produce them and to put them out there and make them available to the whole world basically is entirely free. All you have to do is upload them to iTunes and post them on a website, and there's all sorts of ways to do that I can give details about, if people are interested. Excuse me. So the last piece of this that we talked about, or that we developed, was the social media and launch campaign. For the launch campaign, we set the official opening of the trail to the same day as their spring celebration. They have a spring opening for the information cabin, which you can see behind that group on the top left. That's where people stop when they come into the gorge, usually to find information out about where to go or where to hike. And they had ranger-led talks, and the man there leading a talk is the head of the Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards, who do a lot of trail work and maintenance in and around the area. They also had talks on ecology in general. They had a little bit about fire ecology, but just general ecology of the gorge. So we tied it into this larger celebration that people look forward to every year. And we had this social media launch campaign with #GoodFire. What we asked people to do was to use #GoodFire whenever they're posting photos of the gorge or talking about the history of fire on that landscape or the role of fire on that landscape. You can also see in that top left picture we had a lot of stickers that say the Fire Learning Trail and say #GoodFire. Those are pretty popular. We also had free CDs of the podcast available in the cabin, so about 200 free CDs that went, I think in about 6 months we went through 200 CDs. We had to order more. And brochures, of course. And then these two signs here in the bottom, on the bottom in the middle and on the top right, those are signs that went into landscape. The one in the bottom, again, talking about tying signs to the landscape and to the spot you're in. You can see that picture that we have on the background. That really vibrant picture ties directly to what those people are looking at. So they can see that this isn't a message this isn't an abstract message. It's not for something or somewhere far away from where they're standing. It's tying to, the place that their feet are on at the moment. And just as an additional point about the social media launch campaign, this was something that, might have been harder to sell for me to some of the foresters in the area. There's a lot of people that don't appreciate the value of social media, and it wasn't just that social media is sort of the newfangled way, the new order of how to do things. The reason that we felt like this was vital was because these conversations were already happening on social media. We were seeing misinformation spread through social media. We were seeing these debates happen on Facebook groups and through Twitter accounts. And it just became apparent that, you know, we had to go to their turf. We had to bring this message to them. We couldn't sit back and just sign and podcasts and panel discussions when this whole other conversation is going on online. We had to jump in and participate in some way. And so the Fire Learning Trail in the Linville Gorge Wilderness area opened last May. Since then, we've had 4 more landscapes sign on and that are in some level of development for the Fire Learning Trail. So the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky have their signs in and their podcasts recorded. Those podcast episodes are about to be released. Lake James State Park in North Carolina is in the design process for their signs. Green River Game Lands, which is the site of the fire and fire surrogate study in North Carolina, is in the design process for their signs. Table Rock State Park in South Carolina, I just got a message today that their signs are in, so they're going to be going on the ground very soon. They have their podcast recorded and are ready to do a grand opening. And Table Rock State Park is especially interesting because they are one of the places that were hit by a large wildfire, actually the largest wildfire in the history of the upstate, so we believe, last year. And they want to do controlled burning this year. So they really felt like it was necessary to have messaging on the ground before they do their controlled burns because they anticipated getting a little bit of pushback. You know, it already burned, why are we setting it on fire again? But what they needed to do was burn areas that weren't affected by the wildfire and still needed to get fire on the ground. Carolina Mountain Land Conservancy, I see Tori's on the call. Carolina Mountain Land Conservancy is putting in a new trail system that they are hoping to make a fire learning trail as well. We're working on the design for that. And the Andrew Pickens Ranger District in South Carolina that does a lot of controlled burning and wants to talk about the work that their firefighters are doing and their fire managers are doing. They're going to have one going in as well, probably by the end of the year. And so this slide shows you how we're able to use the original slides as a template. The one on the top left is the one that went in the Linville Gorge. The one at the bottom right is one that will be going in at Table Rock State Park. And you can see that we changed them a little bit. The cost of these signs is fairly, I mean, it's average for signs. We paid about $1,600 per sign, including the hardware, $500 for the actual laminate sign, and then $1,100 for the pedestals and all the hardware. And we ordered them through a local company, so we didn't have to pay for shipping or anything like that. We were able to just go pick them up. And they were a pretty hardcore laminate, something that would be UV resistant. It was warranted for 10 years. So we hope they'll be in the ground for a long time. They're somewhat graffiti resistant. There were concerns in Linville Gorge of people shooting them with BB guns and such. So we tried to get a pretty hardcore material that would stand up to that. So that's where that price sort of comes from. And as far as time cost for developing these signs, you know, it took us about a year to get the signs and the podcast and the social media campaign all the way to a finished spot in the Linville Gorge, you know, to get that stuff really launched and out there and being used by the public. But since then, you know, each time we've been able to do this, the process gets a little bit quicker because we're able to use a template. And, you know, I feel like this is almost like one of those, you know, circle the differences games, because you can see that there's just some slight differences between these signs, and we were able to change things like the font so that it would go with the standards for Table Rock State Park and for South Carolina State Parks, and cut the wording down because they actually had an even harsher limit on wording than what we put in, and changing that graphic in the middle to show where they're going to be doing controlled burns in their park. And so what we've been asking of our partners as we develop these new trails, and if any of you are interested in getting a fire learning trail on your landscape, what we've been asking them is really just for a time commitment, because it does take a bit of a time commitment just to, since I do all the design work personally, it really just takes, you know, finding photos, reviewing signs, being willing and able to get people to record on the podcast, you know, to get those personal stories out there. Basically, that's all it takes besides, you know, the actual investment for the signs. And so to sort of sum up here, I hope you all can take something from our process, and that'll be helpful wherever you work. I really invite all of you to start using #GoodFire to talk about the role in history fire on social media. And with that, I can take questions or we can start discussion whenever everybody's ready.
And I didn't mute anybody, so you should all be able to control your microphones.
And please feel free to ask specifics if if there was something I didn't go over in terms of cost or time or effort. I know I've gotten a lot of questions about that in the past, so.
Well, this is Liz. I've actually done zoo signs in the past. Have you done any follow-up watching people to see how much time they spend at the signs? I used to aim for 23 words was my goal, because I'd heard 8 seconds for zoos. But
some just sort of informally, and it seemed like people were really standing there and watching people. They'll actually stand around and pull someone over and sort of point out things and have a conversation about it. Especially the one at Wisemans Overlook that's tied so directly to what they're looking at, because people can see fire scars on the ground there still from different fires. So seeing that with a timeline of when these fires happened, I think is really powerful. I haven't done any studies, formal studies of seeing how long people actually stand there, but it seems to be that they take in the information. I think part of that is just the aesthetic appeal of the signs, that, they're really bright and bold, with lots of pictures and infographics.
And the timeline, that's good.
Hey, Jen, this is Steve Backers from the Chattahoochee County.
Hey, Steve, glad you were able to join us.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. This is really neat, and enjoyed meeting you yesterday and everybody else. The slide that you did about the succession, has that been kind of reviewed by anybody in the Forest Service or otherwise? I can talk a little bit about our review process for all the signs. For these signs, they went through, I think by the end it was 16 reviewers, including Forest Service employees, Nature Conservancy employees, Joint Fire Science employees, and school-aged children. So there were several people that reviewed it. Was there a specific question you had about it? Well, it's good to know that. First of all, and I'm not a forester, I'm not an expert by any means, and so I want to make sure that it's consistent with, science, not only science, but with agency, kind of language and protocol and things like that. So, I know it's not that in depth, but one thing I was just kind of, I know what succession is, and I think your sign looked pretty good. Wasn't able to read it all, but I'm just thinking in terms of like my 7-year-old son going up and reading that, and I think he would get that. I just kind of, the thought that went through my head was, again, going back to, using your plain language, your TNC guidelines, like you were saying, and wondering, a more basic way of saying succession would be, the circle of life, the circle of the forest, and that kind of thing. Just wondering if there was a way to do that even better. But and then I also know in terms of infographics, we have our Washington office is putting out some interesting ones, and I'm wondering if we could try to get their expertise. They have a person on staff up there in Washington that is just phenomenal in terms of infographic type of art, and just wondering if we should consult with them a little bit to, kind of get the latest kind of buzz. It'd be great if we could adopt a consistent standard and just reusing that across not only the South, but the entire country, because I know that they're doing a lot of stuff out west as well. So just
sure.
for consistency purposes more than anything.
Sure, and I mean, depending on what agency you work for, of course, and the Forest Service has their own special standards for, well, everything, but especially for language. And so that was part of the challenge in designing these signs, is figuring out something that would work across agencies and organizations, something that everybody could kind of get behind. And one of the reasons we chose to just actually use the word succession was because we really wanted to, and this is the only really sort of jargony-ish sign that we use because we use the word succession, but we wanted to introduce that term. And so if you look at the sign, you know, we introduced it at the top sort of in a classic new vocabulary style way with bold wording, and then we repeat it in each of the boxes around the sides. And we thought that things like disturbance and pioneer and maturing forest were concepts that most people can understand. And 7, you know, you mentioned your 7-year-old son, and 7 might be a little bit younger. We usually try to shoot for a 3rd to 5th grade level, depending on the agency and the organization. They usually shoot for 3rd to 5th grade level. So unfortunately, he wasn't our direct target audience. But hopefully, you know, someone younger could still get something out of it. At least get the idea that you know, it's a cycle, it's a circle with the arrows, and with the pictures that, you know, there's a fire and then sort of a damaged forest, but then a forest that's growing up a little bit. So.
And I didn't mean to be critical. I was just, you know, these were just kind of thoughts, and I think it's a great slide. It definitely is a great slide. We actually have an old poster I pulled out of our supply room, and I'll send you a picture of it.
Mm-hmm.
I have a diagram pie chart kind of showing the different stages. It's actually really kind of neat. Our graphic, I'll send that to you just for.
Yeah, I'd love to see that, and I think I really think the power of the process we went through is getting all of the different perspectives and being able to look at it as, you know, we're taking all of these as resources, not as restrictions. So we have all these different resources, like from the Forest Service and the way they've developed their language and their graphics, and the Nature Conservancy and the way they've developed their language and graphics, and the other organizations, and pulling them together to try and create a product that, again, that'll work for all of those organizations. You know, this was a true collaborative process, and it was featured as a cohesive strategy success story because of that, because we were able to take things from all the above. So more information is always welcome, and you know, I don't take it as criticism at all. So the more I can get and the more I can learn, I'm happy to have.
Thanks, that's great, and that's exactly how I intended it. So good. Yeah, I'm happy to collaborate if we can.
Great. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, this is Tori from CMLC. I'm wondering if any future iterations of this signage might include the suggestion to use the hashtag. I'm looking at the slide up front now, and you mentioned the popularity of the tag, and oh, am I unmuted?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay. So it's a really popular tag, but there's no suggestion on the sign itself. I guess maybe just making that comment there. I know things like QR codes have fallen out of favor in use, and no telling what will happen during the lifespan of this sign. You said it was around 10 years, but I was wondering if there's an attempt to engage someone using their technology at the point, or if you were trying to maybe discourage people from just whipping out their cell phones right away there while they were in nature.
Actually, part of the thought on that was, number one, to cut down on anything that wasn't just pure information. So we had talked about QR codes, And there are some areas where the signs are that QR codes would work because there's cell phone service, but a lot of them, there is no cell phone service, so a QR code would be essentially useless. And the reason we stepped away from either including the hashtag or QR codes is because, number one, it takes up place on the sign and it looks a little silly. I'm sort of a stickler for aesthetics. And then it also might be something that won't be there still with the life of the sign. So these signs were made to last for 10+ years. They're, like I said, they're that hardcore laminate. And we hope they'll be in the ground for at least a decade, and who knows what's going to happen a decade from now in terms of technology. And, you know, there's signs on the ground that I've seen before that have websites that, you know, aren't able to be used anymore, things like that, or email addresses that can't be used. So we tried to cut down on that as much as possible. One of the things we talked about doing, though, something that would be less permanent and might give us a better idea of the impact we're having, is having these little selfie stands near the signs where you can actually put a cell phone in it and take a picture of yourself in that spot and post it to social media, and having something on there that says, hey, please use the hashtag #GoodFire when you use this selfie stand, something like that. But we've also spread the message about hashtag #GoodFire in other ways. Like I said, we have the stickers. You'd be amazed at how far a sticker goes. We have it attached to all the podcasts. So on all the podcast chapters, we've mentioned using hashtag #GoodFire. It's on the brochures. And it was on non-permanent signs describing the fire learning trail that were around as well. So we tried to get it out as much as possible without putting it on the permanent sign, you know, in the case that we needed to change it. We also were a little bit, to be honest, we were a little bit worried that it might get co-opted in some way. So we went through the process of registering it. There's a couple of different websites that you can register a hashtag so that you can define it for public use. And the way we defined it is for discussing the role and history of fire on landscapes. So that way, if anyone, you know, started taking it and maybe attaching it to misinformation, or because we've had some pretty aggressive campaigns against controlled burning and fire in the wilderness. So we were concerned that it might, like I said, get co-opted and used in the wrong way. And so we wanted to be able to drop it if need be. So yeah, maybe we were just trying to create or trying to keep ourselves from it being too permanent so that we couldn't, you know, let it go if we needed to. But so far, none of that's happened, so it's been pretty good.
This talk has been a really great resource. So we talked before about recording and posting this. Do you want to let people know where it'll be posted so that they can share it?
Sure. Yeah. So we'll have a recording available of this. So if you want to see it again, or if you have any colleagues that weren't able to join us, we're going to be posting it on our website, www.appalachianfire.org. We actually have a whole video library there with presentations, PowerPoint slides, and video presentations and webinars of dealing with all aspects of fire management, and science communication. So we'll be hosting it on there, and we'll post about it on the consortium's Facebook and Twitter once it's available.
Good. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jen, for great work on the signs and a great presentation. I really look forward to sharing this further. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you all for joining me, and thanks again for hosting.